FoxNewsPodcast.com. The reason why this is an interesting podcast, Walter interviews me about my new book, The Gutfeld Monologue. So it's a reversal. It's a Freaky Friday, except it's Wednesday. And I just tweeted it, so you can go and find it. And all you got to do is go on my Twitter feed, and you'll find the tweet, and you can click on it, and I'll be there with my book. And then you can buy the book, because it'll change your life. It will. It'll make you better.
You just yourself being interviewed on your own podcast about your own book.
Exactly.
You know
well
what
done.
they call that?
And it's based
Diva
all over the
News.
front.
This is the way Gutfeld
News.
does
How
it.
dare you?
Well, you have a full screen for that, a graphic.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay,
it's
good.
the age-old question. Are cats smarter than dogs, or are dogs smarter than cats? And according to the science journal Animal Cognition, the answer is, drumroll please, dogs are smarter than cats and have twice as much raw brain power as cats do. And if you listen to what they're telling you, like my dog Gadsden does, if they put their paw up on, while they're sitting down, they're saying, feed me, just like Gadsden's saying right now.
They're always
actually
saying that.
trying to talk to you.
This is what happens.
Yeah.
This is what happens in this
Dogs are
chair.
smarter
Did I
than cats.
predict we were going to do this story? I said, oh, please,
why?
I bet we're
So
going
you don't have to do it.
Dog brain power.
All right, I love it.
We
It's
love
been
our
fun.
dogs.
Right, set your DVRs, never miss an episode of The Five. Special Report is up next with this guy. Hey, Bret.
Cats and dogs living together. Thanks, Kimberly.
Kind of like The Five.
This is a Fox News Alert. I'm Bret Baier in Washington. We begin tonight with crisis management President Trump style. The president signed an executive order about 3 hours ago that he says will stop the practice of separating children from their parents trying to illegally enter the country. That executive order will likely face some legal challenges in coming days. The president still insisting that Congress act quickly to fix immigration laws broadly. A vote expected on that in the House tomorrow. But his rare turnaround on an issue he insisted that only Congress could fix comes amid the growing outcry, now including the Pope, over a situation many called inhumane. All of the different elements of this story, it's very complex, but the president definitively acted today. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts starts off tonight from the North Lawn. Good evening, John.
Bret, good evening to you. It is an about-face for the president, who insisted up until today that only Congress could fix the problem. But it's highly questionable whether this executive order will even go into effect.
You're going to have a lot of happy people.
Under mounting political pressure, even getting an earful from the First Lady and his daughter, President Trump today moved to solve the crisis on the border, signing an executive order to keep families together.
Ivanka feels very strongly. My wife feels very strongly about it. I feel very strongly about it. I think anybody with a heart would feel very strongly about it. We don't like to see families separated. At the same time, we don't want people coming into our country illegally. This takes care of the problem.
The order seeks to keep families together, but does not end zero tolerance. President Trump directing DHS to keep families in custody for the duration of their immigration proceedings, which could take weeks, even months.
If you're really, really pathetically weak, the country's going to be overrun with millions of people. And if you're strong, then you don't have any heart. That's a tough dilemma. Perhaps I'd rather be strong.
The order runs afoul of an Obama-era court decision. Citing widespread deplorable conditions that children were being held in, California District Judge Dolly G. ruled in 2015 that children could only be detained with their parents for 20 days. In the executive order, President Trump directs the Attorney General to ask Judge G to modify her ruling and allow children to be detained indefinitely. In the unlikely event Judge G were to modify her ruling, opposition groups are ready to pounce at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to stop it. In a statement today, the ACLU saying children don't belong in jail at all, even with their parents under any set of circumstances. If the president thinks placing families in jail indefinitely is what people have been asking for, he is grossly mistaken. If the executive order fails, President Trump will be left with no recourse but to rely on Congress for a fix.
We look forward and expect the House to act this week. We ask them to do their job.
2 Republican-sponsored bills are up for consideration in the House tomorrow, but Democrats don't appear interested in legislation. They simply want President Trump to go back to the old practice of catch and release.
The vast majority of Americans are looking to President Trump's administration, which started this practice, to end it.
President Trump has rejected the notion of handing illegal immigrants an order to appear in court, then releasing them into the U.S., as the Obama administration did. DHS says only 3% of those people ever show up for their court date. But President Trump is feeling the heat. Pope Francis condemned the separation of families, saying it's not easy, but populism is not the solution. At a Mexican restaurant for dinner last night, the DHS secretary was heckled by protesters. In his executive order, President Trump also directs the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, to make space available to house families at U.S. military bases. But all of this hinges on a favorable ruling from Judge G. And if her 2015 ruling is any indication, she is no fan of detaining children. Bret?
John Roberts, live on the North Lawn. John, thanks. The Secret Service was notified by First Lady Melania Trump of a tweet by actor Peter Fonda encouraging someone to, quote, rip Barron Trump from his mother's arms and put him in a cage with pedophiles. Fonda also advocated violence against Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen and called White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders a vulgar term. Spokesman for Fonda likened his statement to one from Pope Francis today. We're learning tonight the administration has been sending babies and other young children separated from their parents to at least 3 so-called tender age shelters in South Texas. Tonight, correspondent Steve Harrigan looks at what's going on there and gets the perspective of some of the caregivers.
More than 2,000 children have been separated from their parents since a zero-tolerance policy for those who enter the U.S. illegally began to be enforced in May. Powerful and at times heart-rending images of separated families have sparked demonstrations in a number of U.S. cities and outrage across the political spectrum.
We spend a lot of money all over the world promoting human rights and democracy and respect for children. And in our own country, we're treating children in a way which describes torture.
Some of the holding facilities are Spartan, little more than mats on caged floors with foil blankets or cots in desert tents. But there has also been some pushback from the men and women who risked their lives to protect the nation's borders.
What's inhumane is putting your child in the trunk of a car. What's inhumane is taking your child and crossing that river.
The Associated Press initially reported the existence of at least 3 tender age shelters in Texas. The Department of Health and Human Services said the goal of such shelters is to keep children and parents as close as possible until the end of court proceedings for those who entered the U.S. illegally.
These children are very small. Many of them don't understand what's going on. They're traumatized by having been pulled from their parents.
With an understaffed federal bureaucracy, language barriers, and illiteracy, reuniting parents and children could prove challenging. Plans to add another tender age shelter to a converted warehouse in Houston have run into local opposition.
And there comes a time when Americans, when Houstonians, when Texans have to say to those higher than ourselves, this is wrong.
A physician who recently toured this tender age shelter described it to Fox News thus: 15 toddlers age 1 to 3 in a room. A homey feeling, plenty of cribs, toys, and books, a competent, caring staff doing their best. But she also said it was abnormal, eerily quiet from the moment she walked in, that for the first time in 30 years as a pediatrician, she saw toddlers in a room with none of them playing, jumping, or even crying. Bret?
Steve, thank you. Let's get information tonight directly from one of the officials at the heart of this issue. Alex Azar is the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. Mr. Secretary, thanks for being here. You saw Steve's report there. What is your reaction to that? You heard the pediatrician talking about her assessment of those kids in those facilities.
So we, through our grantees, take excellent care of these children who are entrusted to our care. We get kids who are unaccompanied. These are kids who've been sent by their parents to cross into the United States by themselves, often with a smuggler, sometimes trafficked into this country, or whose parents have brought them here and crossed illegally and then been arrested for their illegal crossing. They come to us. What do? We provide them with education. We provide them with meals. They get medical care. They get dental. They get vision. They get athletic time. They get entertainment. They get psychiatric care. So we're providing excellent care to these kids until we can get them placed out with a sponsor.
You brought some video. We haven't been able to access on our own, with our own cameras, some of these facilities. These videos that you bring are from 2 different facilities and include girls and young children as well. First, will you let other cameras go in besides the video that you're providing us here? And second, how do you look at these videos to tell this story?
Sure. We've had congressmen, we've had senators, we've had the media come and tour these facilities. Of course, we need to have advance notice. We're protecting minor children here, and these are grantees that are running these programs. So the safety of the kids and their privacy is paramount. But we've had folks coming through touring our facilities. We're very open to that because we deliver excellent care to these kids. This is care that we're quite proud of, and our grantees, they take this mission of looking out for these kids quite seriously.
When you hear critics say the president's executive order today, why didn't he do it 2,000 kids ago? What do you say?
Well, first, we're going to have to see how the implementation of the executive order goes. The Department of Homeland Security is going to have to work with the court and ensure that they're able to keep these families as an integrated unit in detention facilities pending their criminal prosecution of the parents and or the deportation of the whole family for violation of our immigration laws.
And you're a lawyer. I mean, what do you think? I mean, do you think that's possible?
It's going to depend. Our laws in this country on immigration are so messed up. That's what the president's been talking about, is that our laws of immigration are so messed up here that it's an open invitation so often for people to approach our country and come in illegally. And then these kids come across our border alone through traffickers, through smugglers, and they end up going into our care, or their parents bring them here illegally. And then because the parents, if they get arrested, we get them. You know, if you or I, God forbid, get arrested, our kids are going to be taken from us and put in Child Protective Services. These kids are put in our care, and then we try to find sponsors for them here in the country, usually a family member who will take care of them.
What's the breakdown of the kids and the ages? Do we have a sense, or do you have a sense of toddlers versus teenagers versus others?
So the vast majority of kids are teenagers. We have a few that are under the age of 13. We keep them in segregated facilities with separate protocols for taking care of them. They're always in permanent facilities, not in the semi-permanent facilities that you often see on TV. Those are older teenagers that would be in the semi-permanent facilities that we have. And again, these kids are getting the full range of services. America's a generous nation, and America takes care of these kids even though they should not be in the country. They've come here illegally, and we're still caring for them.
So Secretary Nielsen said that's a vast majority, 10,000 of the 12,000 she estimated, were sent here alone by their parents.
That's correct.
That's the number you're working on?
Yep. We've got about 12,000 children currently at our facilities. About 10,000 of them are what we historically, through every past administration, have gotten, kids coming across the border unaccompanied. And then we've got about 2,000 kids currently whose parents have been charged with illegal entry into the country, and because they're charged and detained, the children have been sent to us for care.
So when you see the emotional outcry and people, not only lawmakers, but people taking to the streets, what's your reaction?
Well, we get it. Nobody wants kids separated from their parents. The president said that in your opening. He made it clear he's got deep compassion and heart for these kids and their families. But the simple fact is, the way you prevent separation, the way you prevent your children coming into our care, don't come into our country illegally across at a legal crossing. Go and present yourself at a legal border crossing with the permission to come in the country, or make your case for why you legally should be allowed to enter this country. If you break our laws, you will be prosecuted. If you're prosecuted, you may have your children given into our custody.
If an illegal immigrant goes to declare asylum, to try to get asylum, at one of the legal ports of entry, are they assured today that they can have that processed?
So I receive children at my department. We receive them if they are unaccompanied minor children. You become unaccompanied in that circumstance if your parent is an unacceptable, if they have engaged in trafficking, if it is an unsafe situation for the child.
But let's say they're declaring asylum and with a child.
And there's no reason to believe that the parents are unfit or the child is endangered by being with their parents, then no, they're not going to be sent to us, because the parents aren't going to be arrested and the child will then not be unaccompanied.
How much do you think this is costing the U.S. government?
It is substantial. America makes a substantial financial commitment to serve these children here, and that's why they need to stay. It is a quite substantial financial commitment.
Is there a per day estimate of what it's costing?
Hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And frankly, the permanent facilities cost less than when we have to surge and add more temporary facilities, obviously, because remember, we have to hire vendors who can provide education, security, athletics, medical, the whole range of services for these children. This is not just putting bunk beds up and saying stay here or a hotel.
And are the rules for dealing with the toddlers, for example, there was some thing with that pediatrician Steve talked to that she couldn't hug them, she couldn't touch them. What is the...
Well, so what she reported was that the people in the facility couldn't touch the children or hug them. There's no such rule. I've checked. We don't know what on earth she's referring to there, because obviously subject to state legal requirements around it. There's nothing that prevents appropriate care and compassion towards these children, these toddlers, the holding, the hugging, the care. I don't know what she's talking about.
Gotcha. Last thing, if Congress does move, or if this executive order is upheld and able to stand as it's written, do you think that this problem diminishes?
Well, sure, because if we're able to fulfill the executive order and the Department of Homeland Security keeps families together pending prosecution and or deportation proceedings, then what we're going to be dealing with at HHS is going to be these, again, unaccompanied children who've been sent by their parents or have come on their own into the country as minors, and we'll work to get them placed with a family member sponsor if possible or otherwise. On average, it takes about 58 days for us to place kids with sponsors.
Mr. Secretary, we appreciate the time.
Thank you, Bret.
Up next, the president's Commerce Secretary addresses fears of a trade war with China and also takes questions about his own business dealings. We'll bring you that. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 28 in Columbus, Ohio, as Ohio State University says it's shutting down its 3-year-old sexual civility and empowerment unit after finding it did not properly document and report students' sexual assault complaints. The Columbus Dispatch reports some victims were told they were lying or fabricating their stories. Records show some unit workers also subjected victims to re-traumatizing treatment. Fox 45 in Baltimore as Ellicott City reopens its Main Street Bridge 3 weeks after massive flooding there. Access to most of the main street itself remains closed. The station reports only half of the 70 antique dealers in that area plan to reopen after the second major flood in a year. And this is a live look at New York from Fox 5. One of the big stories there tonight. The city is spending $1 billion to fix gushing leaks in a massive underground tunnel that brings water from reservoirs in the Catskills. Some of the worst of those leaks are 55 stories beneath the Hudson River near Newburgh, New York. Workers there are using a dump truck-sized cylindrical boring machine to dig a separate 2.5-mile tunnel that will bypass some of those leaks. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back. Stocks were mixed today on Wall Street. The Dow dropped 42. The S&P 500 was up 5. The Nasdaq gained 56. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross says President Trump's tariffs on imported products are necessary to revive America's steel and aluminum industries. But he is getting little buy-in from Congress and even less from overseas. Correspondent Rich Edson has that tonight from the State Department. Good evening, Rich.
Hey, good evening, Brett. And international retaliation, bipartisan criticism. That's about the current state of Trump administration tariffs as the Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross drew that criticism before the Senate Finance Committee this morning, defending the Trump administration's tariffs on aluminum and steel before a skeptical Congress.
Mr. Secretary, as you consider these tariffs, know that you are taxing American families, you are putting American jobs at risk, and you are destroying markets, both foreign and domestic, for American businesses of all types, sorts, and sizes.
Idled steel and aluminum capacity is being restarted as we sit here in Illinois, Ohio, South Carolina, Missouri, and Kentucky. Several other companies have also announced new investments in these industries in Oklahoma, Florida, Missouri, and Texas.
This morning, the European Union announced tariffs on more than $3 billion of American imports. The European Trade Commissioner says, quote, "We did not want to be in this position. However, the unilateral and unjustified decision of the U.S. to impose steel and aluminum tariffs on the EU means that we are left with no other choice." President Trump has also criticized European auto imports, and today, U.S. Ambassador to Germany Rick Grenell returned to Washington. A person close to the matter tells Fox he first consulted with German automakers and brings with him a proposal to scrap all auto tariffs between the U.S. and Europe. And then there's China. The administration has already raised tariffs on $50 billion of Chinese imports and is threatening to subject an additional $400 billion. The administration says that China is aggressively trying to acquire American technology, even by stealing it. And when it comes to this trade confrontation with China, the administration says that China has much more to lose here, since it sends much more in products to the United States than the U.S. sends to China. Bret.
Rich, also senators, a few of them criticized the Commerce Secretary on his unquestionable trade. What about that, his personal business dealings?
It is, and this has to do with a report in Forbes that says that Secretary Ross executed a trade with a basically bet against a shipping company that has connections to the Russian government. And days before that, the secretary had learned that a negative story was coming out about that company. That and investments in other types of companies, and there are a number of Democrats who are claiming a conflict of interest.
You don't need a thick government rule book to recognize flagrant conflicts of interest when they're brought into public view. And when it comes to trade, Americans have a right to know it's their best interest Trump administration officials are looking out for at the negotiating table.
In a statement, the Commerce Secretary says, quote, "These allegations are completely false. I did not receive any non-public information due to my government position, nor did I receive any non-public information from a government employee." Ross is maintaining that he's complying with all ethics laws. Bret.
Rich Edson, live at the State Department. Rich, thanks. Up next, how the political crisis about children on the border might affect the midterm elections. Former House Speaker Newt Gingrich is here. First, beyond our borders tonight, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Chinese President Xi Jinping held a second day of talks in Beijing. Kim has thanked Xi for his support in last week's summit with President Trump. Today, South Korea urged Kim to present a plan with concrete steps toward denuclearization. An Afghan official says Taliban fighters have killed at least 30 Afghan soldiers in an attack on 2 checkpoints in the west. The fighters first attacked those checkpoints, then ambushed reinforcements as they arrived. The Taliban had observed a ceasefire over a 3-day religious holiday last weekend, but rejected the government's request for an extension of that ceasefire. And some Russian bars are running low on beer. It's hard to believe, as World Cup soccer fans are drinking parts of Moscow dry. Apparently, some Russian brewers were caught off guard. But one Croatian fan says there is beer everywhere. You just have to know where to find it. Well, good luck with that. On the World Cup stage, just some of the stories beyond our borders tonight. We'll be right back. The political crisis over immigrant children has Republicans worried about the political backlash or possible backlash in the midterm elections. Correspondent Peter Ducey looks at that angle tonight from Capitol Hill.
Republicans in Congress fighting to keep their majorities in the midterms don't think a law that separates border crossing kids and their parents will be a winner for them.
I would say that none of this reflects well on Congress or the administration in terms of our inability to solve the problem.
If the GOP majority leads the way on a legislative fix, Mitch McConnell believes the midterm impact will be minimal.
Well, it's not going to tar anybody. We're going to fix the problem.
But the Democratic leaders trying to retake majorities in Congress are not in a rush to help the party in power pass a new law that ends this crisis. Senator Chuck Schumer seems content to wait until pressure builds to the point that President Trump takes action.
There are so many obstacles to legislation, and when the president can do it with his own pen, It makes no sense.
That strategy is not going to work for one vulnerable Democrat trying to win re-election in a state President Trump won, Senator Joe Manchin.
Well, I'm sorry. I disagree with Chuck, and Chuck knows that. You always negotiate. We're here to fix things. We're not here to make it worse.
As this issue really started to boil this weekend, a Quinnipiac poll found that while just 7% of Democratic voters support separating border-crossing parents and kids, 24% of independents support the policy, and 55% of Republicans do too. Now, one GOP candidate hoping to challenge Massachusetts Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren this fall believes this issue opens Democrats up to major criticism on the campaign trail.
She's gone around the country advocating for sanctuary cities. So she's giving false hope to these families. And so they're making this terrible journey. And so she's giving them the idea that they can find sanctuary in Massachusetts.
But a top Democratic surrogate, this cycled Senator Cory Booker, believes that this issue is too traumatic to be included in talks about flipping seats for now.
We shouldn't be talking about that, honestly. This is a time we should not be engaging in politics. We should not be thinking about election consequences.
A top Trump ally told me tonight they don't expect voters to still be concerned with immigration or talking about immigration when the midterms roll around because, after all, nobody is talking about the North Korea summit today, and that was just last week. Bret?
Thank you, Peter. Joining me now to discuss immigration politics, former House Speaker and Fox News political analyst Newt Gingrich. He is the author of the book, Trump's America. Mr. Speaker, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you.
Your assessment of this, as we've seen the last couple of days, this move by the president to sign this executive order today and how it's falling out.
Well, I think, as usual, it's very partisan. I think the country will be satisfied that the president responded to the problem. He signed an executive order to make sure children are not separated from their parents. They will now implement that. He has said correctly the Congress ought to change the law. After all, it's a law passed by Congress which caused this mess, plus 2 judicial decisions. The Congress ought to pass a law, but you already have Senator Schumer on the Democratic side basically saying he doesn't want to pass a law. He really worries about the children unless it means Donald Trump would win, at which point he doesn't worry about the children because he can't let Trump win. I think this will, in the end, remind people how irresponsible and how intellectually dishonest the Democrats have become.
Senator Kamala Harris was a big advocate of solving this problem. She just tweeted out today, this executive order doesn't fix the crisis. Indefinitely detaining children with their families in camps is inhumane and will not make us safe.
Well, first of all, I think we ought to have an honest conversation at some point about children. Is a 15, 16, or 17-year-old MS-13 gang member a child? And again, we ought to look at in more detail what are we talking about. Second, what Kamala Harris is for is open borders. If she was going to be intellectually honest, she would say her policy is we don't have to detain anybody. You want to come to America, come to America. She's perfectly happy to have the country drowning in people. And Gallup once estimated 165 million people would come to the U.S. if they could get in, which would clearly just drown the entire civilization as we know it.
But you know, obviously, not every child there on the border is tied to MS-13. There are a lot of toddlers and young kids. You have the Vatican, the Pope putting out a couple of messages. We encounter Jesus and those who are poor, rejected, or refugees. Do not let fear get in the way of welcoming our neighbor in need. A person's dignity does not depend on them being a citizen, a migrant, or a refugee. Saving the life of someone fleeing war and poverty is an act of humanity. Your wife is obviously ambassador to the Holy See, and you're not speaking for her. Just not speaking for her, but you see this.
And the emotional answer is simple, but the emotional answer may not be right. I think let me give you another example. One of the things that the Pope cares deeply about, President Trump cares about, and my wife, the ambassador, cares about, is trafficking in human beings. So some of the people who are coming over the border are not parents. They're people bringing young girls and young boys into this country, basically to sell them into sexual slavery. Now, you can't write a simple law that says we're going to presume everybody's innocent, nor should you write a law that presumes everybody's guilty. The president, faced with a Congress which doesn't seem to be functional, has issued an executive order to stop the most immediate problem, which was taking children away from their families. So that's no longer going to be the excuse for Democratic outrage.
You've been around this town for a long time. You've seen a lot of efforts on immigration legislation. There's another one that will be voted on tomorrow. Today on the House floor, you saw Mark Meadows get in the face of the House Speaker. Obviously, there's some back and forth about whether the compromise bill is all that the conservative side of the House really believes it is. Really got in his face today. It's a tough issue to solve, even legislatively.
Yeah, one of the problems, and I've said this starting with President Bush's effort to solve it, that any comprehensive reform gathers more opponents than allies in terms of getting to 218 in the House or to 60 in the Senate. And I've always thought you had to break the bill down into 6 or 8 parts, see if you can get a majority for each part one by one, and recognize
just go one by one on the bills.
Recognize that the majority may change. In some bills, you might actually get Democrats to vote for it. On other bills, you might get most of the Republicans to vote for it. But I think when you bring them all into one place, they aggregate more people voting no than voting yes. That's been a consistent story now for, I guess, 10 or 12 years. And it's a real problem for us as a country. I mean, people should not underestimate how important it is for a country to be able to control its border.
Last thing, at least electorally, it seems the Democrats see this as an issue that is going to help them in the midterms. As you see it, this immigration issue and how it's playing out over the past few days, how do you see it playing?
Well, I think the president was totally right today to issue an executive order. I do not think, and I kept telling people, Ronald Reagan would have understood instantly, crying children on TV is bad. And I think in that sense, solving that immediate problem buys time. I think by the end of the year, it'll probably end up being a wash. I mean, at some point, people also have to recognize how much of this is a cold-hearted calculation by Schumer and the Democrats. The other point I'd make is they introduced a bill in the Senate, the Democrats did, that they got their marginal members to sign on to, which is an insane bill.
The Feinstein bill.
It is coming right back and biting them already. In every single race I know of, the Republican understands how to attack that bill, and they signed on to it. They're co-sponsors. They can't possibly defend it.
Mr. Speaker, we appreciate your time.
Good to be with you.
When we come back, just when did the FBI's investigation into Donald Trump and the Russians really begin? Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says recreational marijuana will be legal nationwide on October 17th in Canada. The Senate gave final passage to the measure yesterday. Canada will become the second in the world to make pot legal nationwide. Uruguay was the first. The retired Archbishop of Washington, D.C. has been removed from public ministry over allegations he sexually abused a teenager in New York more than 40 years ago. The Roman Catholic Church says the allegations against 87-year-old Cardinal Theodore McCarrick were found to be credible and that Pope Francis ordered his removal. McCarrick said in a statement released through the church he accepts the decision but is innocent and has no recollection of abusing anyone. There are concerns growing tonight about Russian interference in this year's elections here in the U.S. Those come as we consider new questions about just when the FBI turned its attention toward candidate Trump and Russian involvement in the 2016 contest. Here's Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge.
Senate testimony revealed former British spy Christopher Steele, who compiled the anti-Trump dossier that was State Department officials 1 month before the presidential election.
Did you have any role in that briefing?
I actively chose not to be part of that briefing.
Newland's testimony may further challenge the Russia investigation timeline. The FBI officially opened its Russia case on July 31st, 2016. Newland, who seemed to choose her words carefully, read Steele's opposition research 2 weeks earlier.
I was first shown excerpts from the dossier, I believe, in mid-July of 2016.
The Senate testimony also explored Russia's efforts to divide Americans in 2016.
The voting machines, while vulnerable, were not the most likely vector for any
Russian activity. Instead, undermining confidence and disrupting it were the more likely goals.
The expectation is that Vladimir Putin's government will target the 2018 midterms with the same cyber tools deployed against his neighbors.
Why did Vladimir Putin think he could get away with treating the United States the way he treats countries in his near abroad?
If you don't make these aggressive moves cost directly, then he will keep pushing.
The Trump administration's foreign policy that puts traditional partners at arm's length may be a complicating factor.
The president has isolated us from allies that we very much need to help us stand up to Russia.
I am very concerned when America's adversaries appear to get better public and private treatment than America's closest friends.
Over the course of 2017 and into this year, the Senate panel heard that Russia has, quote, turbocharged its efforts to fuel divisions over race as well as gun control, and Moscow's tactics are expected to accelerate as the midterms approach. Bret.
Catherine, thank you.
You're welcome.
Next up, the border crisis, what the president is saying and doing. What's next on Capitol Hill? We'll get reaction from the panel when we come back.
We're signing an executive order. It's about keeping families together while at the same time being sure that we have a very powerful, very strong border. And it continues to be a zero tolerance. We have zero tolerance for people that enter our country illegally.
We look forward and expect the House to act this week. We ask them to do their job.
Color us dubious that Congress, the House and Senate, with Republican majorities and strong right-wing elements that hate any change in immigration, could successfully pass legislation.
Well, what is happening with this issue? The president signed an executive order about 3.5 hours ago. Earlier in the day, he tweeted, it's the Democrats' fault. They won't give us the votes needed to pass good immigration legislation. They want open borders, which breeds horrible crime. Republicans want security, but I am working on something. It never ends. The something he was working on, this executive order. The question is what that does and where does it leave the legislation going forward? Let's bring in our panel. Matthew Continetti, editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon. Mara Liasson, national political correspondent of National Public Radio, and Tom Bevan, Real Clear Politics co-founder and president. Mara, the question is whether this executive order will stand and whether the judge will allow the altering of what was a decision.
Right. Part of the executive order is to tell the Justice Department to go to court and see if it can adjust the Flores decision, which requires that kids only be detained for 20 days. So that's one thing. It's interesting. Why didn't the administration challenge Flores earlier if that was the problem? But so that's one question about this.
So the answer would be that they were thinking that Congress would move faster.
Yes, that was
pressuring Congress.
Well, okay,
to move
yes,
faster.
exactly. If it was leverage on Congress to do something, it didn't work. Now there is still bills in front of Congress to deal with the last immigration crisis that the president initiated, which was the Dreamers, and he took away the deportation relief from them because he felt it was unconstitutional. He got a kind of stay from the courts for that one. But the question now is, has Trump given up his leverage with Congress? He just took care of this with an executive order. Will that take the heat off of Congress to pass some kind of legislation to do the same thing?
Congress is voting tomorrow on a couple of different bills. Matthew.
Both likely to fail. I think we saw from the Senate earlier in the year that there's not a consensus on immigration in either party, Republican or Democrat. I think on the child and the family separation issue, this was really travel ban redux. You had a policy that is very important to the president, the zero tolerance policy, but it was implemented in such a way that it left confusion and led to mixed messages, and then led again to the president doing another policy, just like he did with the travel ban, that's likely to be challenged in court. Trump found himself in the wrong end of a 70-30 issue, but now the problem is for the Democrats, because separating families may be unpopular. Zero tolerance, however, is relatively popular. And if the Democrats find themselves attacking a zero tolerance policy while Republicans are doing their best to unify the families and keep them in detention together, I think the Democrats come up short.
Here's the House Majority Leader on this compromise leadership bill.
This is a bill that is consensus. It's a bill that the president supports.
It's a bill that can become law. We're going to have an opportunity to vote on it tomorrow night. The question will be, do people want to play politics, or do they want to put people before politics? Or will one party sit to the sidelines, complain like they've complained for decades, and not step up and solve the problem? That's the question that will be answered tomorrow night.
So does now, with the executive order, whether it stands or not, that change the dynamic for this vote tomorrow?
Well, as Mara said, I mean, I think it does give up a little bit of leverage. It might take the heat off of, look, both of these bills are unlikely to pass. And because
Democrats are going to vote against both of them.
Correct. And look, does it change the calculus? I think Matt's right. In the short term, it certainly solves the problem for Republicans. But if the issue becomes zero tolerance, as Newt said earlier when you interviewed him, the Feinstein bill that all the Democrats in the Senate had signed on to is basically sort of the opposite extreme, which is do not separate. No agency is allowed to separate families under any circumstances anywhere.
In fact, it says no arrests within 100 miles of the border. Now, how does John Tester or Heidi Heitkamp or Joe Donnelly or anybody...
Correct. Meanwhile, you have Kamala Harris saying, look, you know, not separating families is fine, but zero tolerance is also an issue. So if the focus shifts from there, I think Republicans might be able to wriggle their way out of this politically in the short term, and we'll see where it ends up, you know, as an issue in November.
What about, Mara, this, you heard the HHS secretary on the show earlier talking about the conditions and how these kids are treated and the difference between how it's being described by HHS and DHS and some of the Democrats who are going down to these facilities and talking about it.
I don't know if the administration can win the battle over how these kids are treated. I just think as long as they're separated from their parents and they're little and they're crying, that's bad. That's why the president signed the executive order today. Don't forget, on Friday, he said to Fox and Friends, when directly asked, why can't you just sign an executive order? He said, no, I can't do that. So he's decided that the optics of this were bad, not worth it. The politics were not working for him, and he wants to get this issue off the table.
Here is the Senate Majority Leader and the Minority Leader about legislation to deal with this.
Well, it's not going to tar anybody. We're going to fix the problem. The president says we need to act. The Democrats say we need to act, and we say we need to act.
There are so many obstacles to legislation, and when the president can do it with his own pen, it makes no sense.
Well, I'm sorry. I disagree with Chuck, and Chuck knows that. You always negotiate. We're here to fix things. We're not here to make it worse.
Obviously, Joe Manchin up for re-election in West Virginia.
This is why I don't think the Republicans have lost any leverage, because if they pursue skinny bills which address the family issue alone, forget about DACA, forget about visa lottery, but just focus on this, having the families detained together, then the Democrats are in the defensive. How is Schumer going to resist that? And you see in the Manchin quote, I think you'd see Heidi Heitkamp as well, there would be many red state Democrats that are going to look at the polls in their own states and say, if the issue is just the families, we should be addressing this through legislation.
But what about all those moderate Republicans who signed a discharge position because they were desperate to vote on something for the Dreamers?
Once the pictures of the families came to the fore,
but this was
that
an
is
issue
the
that
issue.
Preceded that.
No one is going to come to any consensus.
You think this wipes the Dreamer problem off?
Totally. And there's much less of a social outrage over the Dreamers than there is with the pictures of the children.
A lot of moderate Republicans seem pretty desperate to vote for the Dreamers just a couple of weeks ago.
Right, they would be. But when you're talking about a 70-30 issue here with the families, this is of overriding importance. And so by embracing action to take it, Trump's done his part, what he can. It might not hold up. But the Republicans, if they say we are for keeping these families together, I think that puts the Democrats on the defensive.
Pretty amazing how the whole thing shifted. I mean, it obviously is an emotional issue. You see the pictures and they're emotional. But boy, it just went full steam on that side.
No, we reached a tipping point, and you had the administration sort of acting. There wasn't any compassion coming from the administration, any of the officials there, and on the other side, you had all emotion coming from Democrats and liberals. And look, Trump hates to show weakness. This is the last thing he wanted to do. So the fact that he turned around and did it in such a quick time frame shows you just how much pressure he was under and what a losing issue he thinks it's going to be. But look, he's going to keep pushing immigration. I think strong border. He's going to want the wall. He's going to push that all the way through November because he thinks that's a winning issue for his base.
And it may be. Panel, thank you. We have a quick correction. In Peter Ducey's report earlier, we used a picture purportedly showing a child in a cage as part of the uproar over children separated from their parents along the border. We're told this picture is taken out of context. It was, in fact, staged as part of a protest for detentions, and we apologize for that error. It ended up in that piece. We wanted to correct it once we learned about it. When we come back, traveling a long way to keep a promise.